Hello everyone, this is Ben, and welcome to Breaking into Oathbreaker, the series where I help bridge the gap between Oathbreaker and Commander. I'm going to assume you've at least heard of Oathbreaker and are familiar with the basics of the format. If you aren't, I suggest you check out their website linked in the video description below. In this week's video, I'll be addressing some of the common complaints I've heard about the format, a brief analysis of the ban list compared to Commanders, and a basic introduction of deck building for the format. I will be doing my best to include timestamps in the video description below, so you can jump to which section you want. Also, if you can give this video a like, it really helps out the channel. So without further ado, let's get into it. One of the most common complaints I've heard when bringing up the format to other players is the seemingly overpowered, unfun, or just straight up degenerate combinations. One of the combos I've heard repeated is Narset Parter Veils and Windfall. Yes, this is a pretty nasty combination, but there are a few things to keep in mind. Number 1, signature spells aren't hidden information. If you see a deck with a powerful signature spell and planeswalker combination, you have the ability to focus that player out of the game. Remember, this is a multiplayer format. And number 2, have a discussion with your playgroup about the power level everyone wants to play at. You don't have to play these powerful combos just because you can. And the other complaint I've heard, granted not as often, is the fear of the format being solved. There are over 200 Oathbreaker legal planeswalkers and over 5,000 possible signature spells. I will let people who are far better at math than me calculate the exact combinations, but it is a lot. And you can look at a format like CDH that isn't even solved, and there are a ton more resources for that format. Much like Commander, there will be combinations that might be considered best for certain archetypes, but that doesn't mean you have to build that deck. Overall, I think the format is in a great spot and lets you play some of Commander's more overpowered cards. One of the biggest differences of the formats is Oathbreaker's lack of generically powerful fast mana. You lose access to some of the best mana rocks in Commander. Sol Ring, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Jeweled Lotus, and Lion's Eye Diamond are all banned. Given the smaller deck sizes and the lower life totals of Oathbreaker, games tend to be faster, so fast mana can create an insurmountable advantage, leading to much faster and probably less fun games overall. There is a reason these cards are limited even in the most powerful formats of Magic, and there is some argument to ban them in Commander. However, that is a conversation for a different time. Since we get free spells in the command zone essentially, certain rituals are banned: Dark Ritual, High Tide, and Mana Geyser. While rituals aren't permanent mana, having consistent access to them can lead to the same thing permanent fast mana does, especially if you were to build a deck around abusing them in some way. While you do need your Oathbreaker in play in order to cast your signature spell, there are plenty 2 or 3 mana planeswalkers you can run to get access to these cards as early as turn 3 with some ramp. Similarly to fast mana, 1-card combos are banned as well. Giving players access to cards such as Doomsday, Natural Order, or Ad Nauseam would likely lead to uninteractive games where everyone is trying to turbo into these spells, which is why those are banned along with Tooth and Nail, Expropriate, and Primal Surge. After all, 60-card decks offer more consistency, even when considering the format is singleton. And while they could ban them as signature spells, you still have access to Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and Mystical Tutor as a signature spell. However, some of Commander's most notorious combo pieces are unbanned here. You can play your Paradox Engine, Panoptic Mirror, and Coalition Victory as much as you want. Granted, Coalition Victory can only be played with Jared Carthalion, but it can be your signature spell, so that's cute. The final banned card I want to bring up is Saheeli the Gifted. At time of recording, she's the only banned planeswalker in Oathbreaker. The reason given on the website is she's simply too powerful as an Oathbreaker, which makes sense. Her +1 ability can likely be abused with signature spells such as Saheeli's Directive, War of Invention, and Thoughtcast, essentially acting as fast mana in the command zone. As time goes on, you might see more planeswalkers get the ban hammer, but for now, only one is egregious enough to ban. And now for the fun part. So of the roughly 45 cards banned in Commander, excluding the culturally sensitive and silver bordered ones, 19 of them are legal in Oathbreaker, including everyone's favorite otter, Lutri the Spellchaser. Note, Companion isn't actually allowed in Oathbreaker, so you can't have it as a companion. Some of the most notable cards are Karakas, Leovold Emissary of Trest, please note there are no Sultai planeswalkers at this time, Prophet of Kruphix, and one of my favorite green creatures of all time, Primeval Titan. While you might not agree with some of these cards being unbanned, in a 60-card format with only 20 life, they tend to be a lot less problematic. There'll be a link in the video description of a Google Sheet comparing the banned list of each format, so you can take a look at that at the end of this video. I'm sure all of you know the different Commander deck building templates floating around the internet from popular content creators. For sake of this video, I tend to use this general outline when building decks. 45 to 50 mana sources, including ramp, 6 to 8 targeted removal and or counter spells, 2 to 3 board wipes, 0 to 3 flexible tutors, 1 to 2 pieces of graveyard hate, and 1 to 3 pieces of graveyard recursion. I try to overlap all these categories with whatever the theme of my deck is, so I have more flex spots. But for Oathbreaker, you shouldn't simply reduce these numbers by 40% and call it a day. Given the more limited amount of card slots, I tend to use 1v1 60-card decks of whatever archetype I'm building as a pseudo guide. For example, if I wanted to build a Storm deck, I might look at some modern Storm lists that have been tuned for years as my starting point. There isn't going to be a hard and fast rule when building your deck. I wish I could tell you the exact ratios to use, but it will be dependent on your deck strategy. There are a few things to keep in mind when brewing a new list. How proactive or reactive is your deck? How reliant are you on having your Oathbreaker or access to your signature spell? And what's the curve of your deck? For example, I have a Kaido Dancing Shadow and Theoretical Duplication blue-black tempo deck that only runs 22 lands with no real ramp, a good chunk of removal, and a curve that stops at 4. I don't need to run ramps such as Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, or Talisman of Dominance. Instead, I added more removal, such as Infernal Grasp, Shouldered's Edict, and Disallow. I'm not reliant on my Oathbreaker or signature spell to win the game, and I tend to draw a ton of cards. Compare that to my Tyvar Jubilant Brawler and Hurricane Elf Ball deck, where Hurricane is my main win condition, and Tyvar gives my mana dork pseudo haste. I run 0 removal, a ton of elves, and only 18 lands, so I can turbo into a win on turn 3 as often as possible. I sacrificed interaction in order to hyper-focus on my combo. And finally, selecting your signature spell. There are several things I think about when picking a signature spell for a deck. First, does that spell fit the theme of the deck? For example, I wouldn't want to run Elder Spell if I'm playing an Oathbreaker without a proper ultimate, or Wrath of God if I'm playing a go-wide deck. Just because a spell is powerful in a vacuum doesn't mean it's necessarily good for your deck. Second, what is the purpose of the spell? Do I want to have access to card draw, removal, or a tutor every game? For a mono green deck, you might play Shamanic Revelation because your deck needs card draw, or Naturalize if you know your deck won't function against certain enchantment or artifacts. And finally, how much hate will I get for playing this spell? There are some seemingly powerful cards you can play as your signature spell. As I mentioned earlier, you have Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, or Mystical Tutor, making every card in your deck essentially your signature spell. You also have free interactions such as Force of Will or Force of Negation, and even Time Twister is legal. But as I mentioned earlier, everyone will see your signature spell at the start of the game, so be careful not to pick something that is seemingly too powerful, or you're likely to either get focused down or have your Oathbreaker removed to prevent you from casting the spell. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video in the series where I go over staples you should include in your next Oathbreaker deck. And with that, thanks for watching. A special shout out to my patrons shown on screen here. And again, if you'd like to join them in supporting the channel, I have a link to my Patreon in the video description below. Otherwise, just give this video a like if you liked it, dislike if you didn't. Also, don't forget to check out my article over at the Commander's Herald, linked in the video description below. This has been Ben with Bathroom Brews MTG, and remember, always wash your hands.